It was a Sunday evening, late October. I'd spent the weekend at my parents' place up in Eureka, a small city on the northern California coast, about 5 hours north of Oakland, where I was living at the time. If you've never driven Highway 101 along that stretch at night, let me explain what it's like. During the day, it's one of the most beautiful drives in the country. Old-growth redwoods pressing in on both sides, sea cliffs dropping off to the Pacific, the kind of quiet that feels ancient. At night, it becomes something different. Long, empty stretches with no other cars, no cell service, barely any lights except your own headlights bouncing back off the center line. The kind of darkness that feels like it has weight. I left my parents' place around 8 o'clock, which, in hindsight, was the first mistake. I had an early shift Monday morning and figured I'd rather knock out the drive than stay another night. I was tired, but not dangerously so. The comfortable kind of tired. Road tired. The first 2 hours were fine. It was somewhere around Trinidad when the fog started. Coastal fog up there isn't unusual. Anyone who's spent time on the Northern California coast knows it comes in off the water low and thick and settles for hours. But this was different from anything I'd seen before. Within 5 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, it went from clear visibility to barely being able to see 20 feet ahead of my car. My headlights just hit the wall of it and reflected back. The road in front of me dissolved into white nothing. I slowed to 35 and kept going. The smart move would have been to pull off and wait it out, but there were almost no places to stop on that stretch, and I was tired, and I just wanted to get home. Here's something about driving in that kind of fog that people don't talk about enough. It destroys your sense of space. You can't see landmarks. You can't tell how far you've come. You can't see what's ahead. Your whole world shrinks to a pale circle 20 feet across, and everything beyond that circle stops existing. After a while, your brain starts reaching for reference points that aren't there. It gets disorienting in a way that's hard to explain unless you've experienced it. You start to feel unmoored, like you're moving through something that has no edges and no end. I'd been in the fog for maybe 30 minutes when I saw the first figure. I call it a figure because that's genuinely what it looked like at first, just a shape at the very edge of my headlights. Something standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe 50 feet ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a person, a man, from how tall he stood. He was facing the road directly, not walking, not waving me down for a ride, not on his phone, just standing there, perfectly still. I slowed to maybe 25 as I passed. I was worried he'd step out into the lane. He didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't turn his head as my car went by. I got a clear look at his face in my headlights. Nothing unusual about it. Just a man, standing on the shoulder of an empty highway at 10 o'clock at night in the middle of a fog bank. My brain immediately reached for the logical explanation. Car trouble. Someone whose car had broken down further up the road, waiting for a ride. It made sense. I told myself it made sense. I even considered turning around to offer help. But something stopped me. Something I couldn't name then and still can't now. The way he was standing, maybe. The absolute stillness. The fact that he hadn't even glanced at my car as it passed. Something about it felt wrong in a way that bypassed logic entirely. Went straight to the gut. I kept driving. 10 minutes later, I saw him again. I'm not exaggerating when I say I almost drove off the road. It was the same man. Same build, same dark clothing, same rigid posture on the shoulder. The only difference was that this time he was standing on the left side of the road instead of the right. But everything else, everything, was identical. I said what the hell out loud to the empty car because there was genuinely no explanation for what I was seeing. I was the only car on that road. There were no cross streets, no shortcuts, no turnoffs in that stretch. The only possible explanation was that it was a different person who happened to look exactly like the first, standing in exactly the same unnerving way, on a deserted, foggy highway at the same time of night. I didn't believe that for a single second. I couldn't help myself. I looked at his face as I passed, and this time he looked back. His head turned, quick, precise, like a mechanism, and he locked eyes with me through the passenger window. I yanked my gaze forward and pressed the accelerator down. Not all the way. The fog was still thick, and I wasn't going to drive myself off the road. But enough. I needed distance between me and whatever was happening back there. The fog got worse after that. Thicker, if that was even possible. I could barely make out the center line. I had no choice but to slow back down. I was having trouble thinking clearly. The exhaustion, the fog, the driving, it all pressed together into a kind of low static that made it hard to reason properly. I kept trying to build an explanation, and the structure kept collapsing. I kept coming back to the same impossible fact. I had seen the same man in 2 different places with no way for him to have gotten between them. I was still trying to work that out when my headlights found the 3rd figure. He was standing in the middle of the road. I stopped the car. He was wearing a hood this time, pulled forward enough that I couldn't make out his face. He stood dead center in my lane. Didn't move when my headlights hit him. Didn't react to the car at all. We sat there in that standstill, my engine running, the fog pressing in on all sides, this hooded shape just existing in my headlights. And I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Real fear, the kind that lives below thought. I flashed my brights. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. He didn't move. Didn't raise a hand. Didn't step aside. I shifted into reverse. I looked in my rearview mirror. There was someone behind me, not far back, maybe 30 feet. A shape, moving slowly toward the rear of my car. I heard myself yell. I don't even remember what I said. I threw the car back into drive, pulled hard right into the oncoming lane, and floored it. The hooded figure in the road didn't move, and I went around him with maybe a foot to spare. I thought I was clear. Then something hit my car. It wasn't a tap. It was violent. The entire back end of the car lurched sideways. I heard a sound like metal folding. I gripped the wheel and kept it straight and kept driving, convinced I had sideswiped something. A guardrail, a post, something I hadn't seen. When I checked my mirrors, there was nothing behind me. No guardrail, no post, no figures, just fog and empty road and the dark. I drove to the 101 interchange with my hands shaking on the wheel. By the time I cleared the fog and could see properly again, I had mostly convinced myself of the only explanation that made any sense. I had hallucinated. For hours of driving. Exhaustion. Isolation. The disorienting effect of thick fog on a tired brain. A vivid, specific, utterly convincing hallucination. It wasn't a satisfying explanation, but it was the only one I had. I got home. I walked inside. I almost went straight to bed. Then I walked back outside and looked at my car. The rear bumper was destroyed. A massive dent, running nearly the full width of it. Deep and violent, the kind of damage you'd expect from a high-speed collision. I stood in my driveway and stared at it for a long time. I walked around it. I crouched down and looked closely at the paint. No transfer, not a trace of paint from another vehicle. Whatever had hit me had not been a car. I called the police, not because I thought it would go anywhere. I just needed the information recorded somewhere outside my own skull. They took the report. Nothing came of it. I've spent 4 years trying to reconcile 2 facts that refused to coexist. I hallucinated the figures, and something physically struck my car with enough force to destroy the bumper. I've never found a way to hold both of those things at the same time without one of them falling apart. I'm a college senior. I went home for spring break a few weeks ago, back to the suburban town I grew up in, the kind of place that's technically close to a city but shares none of its benefits. No nightlife. No bars you can walk to. Nothing, really, once you're past a certain age. All my hometown friends had different spring break schedules. I was looking at 7 days with nothing to do, which, given that I'd been trying to cut back on some things, drinking mainly some nicotine, was either going to go very well or very badly. I decided to work out twice a day, lift in the mornings, run in the afternoons, keep my body busy so my brain had less room to spiral. That's how I ended up on the trail on a Tuesday. There's a loop I used to run in high school, back when I did cross country. Exactly 3 miles from start to finish, beginning and ending at my house. The route cuts through my neighborhood for the first quarter mile, then enters a patch of woods, not large, maybe half a mile across, on a dirt trail before spitting you back out on the street about a block from home. I ran that loop hundreds of times between freshman and senior year. I headed out around 5 in the afternoon. Plenty of daylight left. What I noticed the moment I stepped outside was the fog. I've lived in that town my entire life. I've never seen fog like that there, not once. It didn't belong. It sat too low, too thick, too still for the time of day and the season. Everything past 30 or 40 feet just dissolved into pale gray haze. It looked almost artificial, the way certain video games render distance. Flat and total and wrong. I almost went back inside. I talked myself out of it. I knew that trail like I knew my own bedroom. One path. No forks. No alternate routes. I could run it half asleep. I had my GPS watch. Getting lost wasn't even a possibility. I started my run. The first mile and a half were normal. The fog was thicker inside the trees. The canopy blocked what little late afternoon light remained, but the trail was easy to follow. I checked my watch at the mile mark. Everything fine. Checked it again at a mile and a half. Still fine. The problem started at 2.5 miles. At that point in the loop, I should have been close to the end of the trail. I know that section by feel. The path curves left, climbs a small hill, and you emerge back onto pavement within about 30 seconds. I've been there so many times the muscles know it before the brain does. But when I checked my watch and it read 2.5 miles, I was still deep in the woods, completely surrounded by trees on both sides. No curve in sight, no hill, no hint of a road. I told myself the GPS was glitching. The watch was 4 years old. Dense tree coverage messes with satellite signal. Fog could be a factor too. These were reasonable explanations. I kept running. I passed 3 miles. 3 miles is the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been standing in my driveway or on the street in front of my house. Instead, I was still on the dirt trail, surrounded by trees, with no indication I was anywhere near the exit. I stopped running. I stood there and tried to think clearly. There was only one trail. I knew this as a fact. No forks, no branches, no diverging paths. Just the single dirt track I'd been following since the trailhead. The only way I could have gotten genuinely lost was if I'd left the path and walked into the undergrowth, which I hadn't done. I had been on the trail the entire time. My watch read 3.1 miles. Still ticking upward. Standing still. The GPS was broken. That was the only rational explanation for the distance. But it didn't explain why I wasn't at the end of the trail. I made a decision. I'd turn around, retrace my steps back to the trailhead, and take the street home from there. Simple. Logical. The one direction I was certain of. I turned around and started running back. The fog had gotten worse. I don't know how else to say it. I hadn't thought it could get worse inside the tree cover, but it had. I could barely see the trail 15 feet in front of me. I slowed down to avoid running off the path. I was about a mile into the return run, for total miles on my legs at that point, when I heard the sound. Those woods are quiet. Genuinely quiet. The patch is too small to support much wildlife, and the neighborhood around it keeps most animals out. Running in there is usually like running inside a held breath. No birds, no rustling, just your footsteps and your own breathing. What I heard broke that silence in a way I felt in my chest before I processed it in my head. It was a sound I have no good word for. The closest I can get is a moan, but that's not right. Lower than a moan. More like a drone, a sustained, wavering tone that swelled and dipped in slow, rhythmic cycles. Almost like a siren, except human. Except wrong in a way that told every animal part of my brain that this was not a person in distress. This was not a person calling for help. Whatever was making that sound was making it intentionally, for a purpose I couldn't identify. I ran faster. I had 4 miles on my legs. I was already tired. I could only go so fast, and every time I pushed harder, I burned down reserves I needed. But I ran faster anyway, because the sound was still there, and it was keeping pace. I looked back 3 times. Each time, fog. Just fog. Nothing visible in it. But the sound stayed with me, constant and close, for what felt like an impossible stretch of time. My lungs were burning. My legs were failing. And whatever was behind me in the fog kept that same awful wavering rhythm and refused to fall back. Then I saw light. Gray, diffuse, the light of an overcast sky. The trail mouth. The street. I burst out of the woods and nearly fell. I caught myself on a knee in the grass at the edge of the trail, gasping, heart slamming. I was on the street. I was out. For a moment I just breathed. Then I looked back at the trail mouth. Something was standing just inside the tree line. Not far back. Maybe 20 feet in, where the trail disappears into the fog. A shape. Dark, formless, massive. I'm 6 feet 1 inch tall. Whatever I was looking at was taller than me by a significant margin. A foot at least. Maybe more. It was not a tree. I knew every tree at that trail mouth, and this was not one of them. It was standing in the gap between 2 familiar trunks, and it was swaying. Slowly. Back and forth. Like something breathing, but not quite like anything breathing. It didn't come toward me. It didn't make a sound. It just watched. Or whatever the equivalent of watching is when you can't see a face. I turned and ran home without looking back a single time. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back to that trail. I don't think I'm going to go back. I told my parents what I saw, and they were convinced it was just someone trying to frighten me. Some tall person messing around in the fog. I understand why they'd think that. But I keep coming back to the sound. The drone. Whatever was making it was running, matching my pace through dense fog on a narrow trail for nearly a mile, and producing that sustained, wavering tone the entire time. Human lungs don't work that way. Human legs don't move that quietly. And the size of the thing in the trees. I don't think it was a person. My friend Edwin and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for 2 years before we finally committed to a weekend and went. Willapa Bay is a massive tidal estuary on the Washington coast, roughly 25 miles long, mostly oyster farms and wildlife refuge. On a clear day, it's one of the most peaceful places I've ever been in my life. Wide, shallow water. Herons standing motionless in the channels. The particular salt smell of a bay at low tide. On the weekend Edwin and I chose, it was not a clear day. We weren't amateurs. That's important context. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids, and Edwin had actually guided kayak tours for a few summers during college. We knew how to read water, how to navigate in low visibility, and how to behave sensibly when conditions got difficult. We were not two idiots who panicked because they couldn't see. We launched early Saturday morning from a put-in near Tokeland. The fog was thick from the start, but that wasn't unusual for the Washington coast in September, and we both figured it would burn off by mid-morning the way it usually does. We had a GPS, a compass, a chart, and enough experience to use all three. The plan was to paddle out toward Long Island, maybe eat lunch on one of the sandbars, and head back before the afternoon tide shift. The first hour was fine. Fog on the water does something strange to sound. It muffles some things and carries others. Voices disappear within 50 feet, but certain sounds, the knock of a hull, the drip of an oar, travel in odd directions, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We knew that. We accounted for it. It was around 9 in the morning when I first heard the rowing. I thought at first it was Edwin adjusting his stroke. We were paddling maybe 15 feet apart, loose tandem formation, close enough to keep each other in sight. But when I glanced over, his paddle was resting flat across his kayak. He wasn't moving. He asked if I'd heard it too. I nodded. We both stopped and drifted, listening. It was oars, not paddles. The sound is distinct if you know what you're listening for. Paddles dip and pull with a sharper, quicker rhythm. Oars are slower, heavier, the sound of wood bending against water. Whoever was out there was rowing a traditional rowboat. The sound was coming from our right, somewhere in the fog. Maybe 100 feet, maybe less. Edwin figured it was probably a local fisherman checking crab pots. Reasonable. We waited for them to announce themselves. Standard practice in low-visibility water is to call out so other boats know where you are. The rowing continued at the same steady pace. No voice, no acknowledgement. Edwin called out into the fog. "Hello," loud and clear. Silence for a moment. Then the rowing again. Same rhythm, same pace. As if we hadn't spoken, we started paddling again, angling slightly east toward shore, figuring we'd either come across the other boat or it would pass us. But over the next 20 minutes, the rowing neither closed the distance nor fell behind. It maintained the exact same spacing, whatever that spacing was, somewhere in the fog to our right, for the entire time. Same rhythm, same pace, for 20 full minutes. I've thought about how hard that would be. To deliberately maintain exact relative distance from two moving kayaks in zero visibility fog, without GPS, without being able to see them. It would be nearly impossible for a skilled boater. For someone just rowing casually, it shouldn't be possible at all. At some point the fog thinned, just for a moment. Just enough. I saw it. A small wooden rowboat, dark-hulled, maybe 40 feet away. A figure at the oars, bent forward in the rowing posture, pulling back. I couldn't make out a face or any detail. Then the fog closed back in and they were gone. The whole glimpse lasted 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he'd seen it. He had. Neither of us said anything for a moment. I started paddling towards shore without discussing it. Edwin followed. We navigated southeast, moving as quickly as we could without exhausting ourselves. The rowing sound stayed parallel to us the entire time. When the fog finally began to lift, not fully, but enough to see 100 yards, I looked to where the sound had been coming from. Open water, empty in every direction. No boat, no figure, no explanation. We hit the shallows and I stepped out into knee-deep water. Cold enough to shock the breath out of me, but I barely noticed. I just needed to be on land. We stood on the beach for a minute without speaking. Then Edwin walked a little ways up the shore and stopped. He told me to come look at something. I walked up behind him. There were footprints in the sand, barefoot, adult-sized, leading out of the water and up onto the beach. Water still pooled in the depressions. They were so fresh. The prints came up from the waterline, moved a few feet toward the tree line, then turned and followed the shoreline to the left, in our direction, before eventually cutting back up toward the trees and vanishing into the woods. I traced them backward with my eyes. They were coming from further down the beach. Whoever had made them had walked up along the water's edge, come up onto the beach at the exact spot where we had just landed, and then gone into the forest. I told Edwin I wanted to follow the footprints the other direction, not into the trees, just back down the beach, toward wherever they had come from. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. He didn't want to come, but he also didn't want to stand alone on that beach. After 30 seconds of back and forth, he came. We walked down the shoreline, following the trail of prints in reverse. About 2 or 3 minutes down the beach, I saw the rowboat. Pulled up on the sand at an angle. Dark-hulled wood, almost black. Oars resting inside. It was the same boat I'd seen through the fog. I was certain of it. The size, the color, the shape. No question. And a trail of wet footprints leading away from it toward where we were standing. Edwin grabbed my arm before I could take another step toward it. He told me we were leaving. He said he wasn't asking. He said he didn't care what was in the boat or who had rowed it. We were done. Something about the way he said it. Edwin, who had guided tours, who was calm on water in ways that made other people calmer. Something about hearing that specific tone in his voice shifted everything. The curiosity drained out of me, and what was left underneath it was cold and simple and clear. We turned around and walked quickly back to our kayaks. Edwin was practically running. We shoved them into the water and paddled out without looking back. I've turned this over in my mind for 6 years. I've been through every version of a rational explanation. The best one, the most generous one, is that it was an elaborate prank. Someone who knew we were launching that morning, who tracked us across the bay in the fog, who somehow beached their boat before us and staged the footprints. Possible, technically. I've never been able to make myself believe it. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We changed course multiple times. We made a hard run for shore once the fog began to lift. In a slower vessel, a rowboat against 2 kayaks paddled by experienced kayakers. Whoever was in that boat would have had to reach the beach before us, drag the boat up the sand, walk down the shoreline to the exact spot where we happened to land, and then disappear into the trees. All of it completed before we touched the shore. In a rowboat, through tidal fog, knowing exactly where we would end up. I've told these 3 stories to a lot of people over the years. Most of them find individual explanations for each one. Exhaustion on the highway, a stranger in the woods, a fisherman with no interest in social niceties on the bay. These explanations are possible. I don't dismiss them. What I can't get anyone to address is the pattern. All 3 incidents. Heavy, unusual fog. Fog that seemed wrong for the location and the time. Fog that arrived suddenly and behaved strangely. All 3 incidents. Figures that appeared in impossible positions. The man on the highway who couldn't have moved between 2 points. The thing in the woods that was too large and too quiet to be a person. The rower who was nowhere and then everywhere and then gone. All 3 incidents. The same sensation. Not quite fear at first. Something quieter. The gut-level recognition that something in the environment had shifted from neutral to aware. That the fog wasn't just weather. That something in it had noticed me.